Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about possible sponsorships entering college football and college sports overall. Definitely something that you wouldn't love to see, but it's the reality of college sports. You got to find that money somewhere. Definitely something that is going to be interesting to watch. But let's talk about some of the different scheduling details that have come out. We have gotten tons of new game times, tons of different, maybe some mix up to some game times that you didn't expect, and definitely a lot of things to break down with this. So this likely will not get to all of the bases. Definitely a ton of things to cover from yesterday, but let's just give you guys an idea of where we're sitting right now and kind of how all of this is looking going into this season. So one of the biggest things, I think probably the biggest thing that came out yesterday is Texas Oklahoma. The Red River rivalry will be at 3:30. It will be in that prime SEC slot at 3:30 on ESPN this time around as CBS is moving on to the Big 10. Definitely a devastating turn of events there, but the reality is this is a very very interesting thing. I mean, I for the longest time remember this thing being played on noon at noon. It wasn't played at noon in 2017, I remember, but other than that, that's as I remember it, if I'm being totally honest with you. So definitely a very big shift, but I think when you look at it at face value, this is something that was pretty much always going to happen. You look at these two programs, two historic programs, two blue bloods entering the SEC. You want to highlight them as much as possible. You want to give them as much shine as possible, and this is the game that a lot of SEC fans need to be introduced to because I've said it on here before. I think it's the best rivalry in all of college football. I'm not going to say it's, better than some of the SEC ones in terms of the SEC ramifications, but the reality is this game is unlike any other. You have a ton of people out at the state fair that just walk right in and then they're a little bit too drunk probably, but the reality is it is a ton of fun. There are fans split down the 50, which does not happen really anywhere else in college football. There's so much going into this and definitely going to be fascinating to watch. Now, one of the things I will say is a 3:30 kick in Dallas in that time of year is a dangerous game. There will be plenty of EMTs on site, I hope, and it will be hot, and there will be people that definitely didn't drink a lot of water that morning. I'll put it that way. But it'll be a fascinating thing to watch. I've seen kind of a mixed reaction from both fan bases. Some absolutely love it and have been begging for this. Some don't love it and absolutely hate this. So definitely something that will be really interesting to watch. For me, I don't much care, if I'm being totally honest with you. They could play this game at 3 a.m. on 480p and I would be watching it. So I don't know. It's one of those things that I could get upset about it. I could be mad that it's moving back 3.5 hours, but it's all the same to me. I'm still going to watch this game very closely, still going to love it, and it's still going to be one of the best games that we see all year. So I definitely am not necessarily as beaten up about this as some others. One other interesting thing that happened, Ole Miss and Mississippi State are moving over to Black Friday. They're going to play 3:30 on that day. Definitely a very interesting move. They were the Thanksgiving game. They were the game where you'd either finish up Thanksgiving dinner or you get your second plate after a little early Thanksgiving dinner and you sit down and you watch the Egg Bowl. And it's one of the very, very fun traditions. And taking that away makes me a little bit sad. I'll be totally honest with you. This was a game that I love to watch every Thanksgiving. That being said, when you're competing with the NFL, especially that night game, it gets a little bit tough. And so I totally understand this move. I think it's something that will probably increase the viewership on this game, and it absolutely should be a game that we look at very closely because it deserves a lot of love. It is a fascinating game that is so interesting that is definitely something that I really want to watch very, very closely. So don't necessarily hate it. I do wish we had something on Thanksgiving. I know that Texas A&M used to play on that day. It sounds like Trev Alberts, the new A&M AD, is not necessarily too keen on that idea of moving it back to Thanksgiving, but it sounds like Texas is very keen on that idea. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see if the SEC wants to move it there or does not. Right now it's scheduled on that Saturday, and I think it'll stay there at least for this year, but we'll see what happens in the future for that one. I think one of the other big time changes was another rivalry. We kind of got some big time news around those. Clean old fashioned hate, Georgia Tech against Georgia, has moved back to Black Friday. They're going to play right after the Egg Bowl at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. All of these times are Eastern, by the way. So this is definitely going to be a very interesting change. I remember this game being at noon on Saturday for pretty much my entire life. I've been to a ton of these games. Definitely a very, very interesting thing. This is the first time Georgia has played Georgia Tech on a Friday since 1994, and the last non-Saturday game that'll be played in Athens since I believe that game, if I'm being totally honest. Oh, excuse me. No, since 1995. I was reading that wrong. But the Bulldogs played Georgia Tech on Thanksgiving Day in 1995. So that would be the last time that Georgia played any game in Sanford Stadium that was not on a Saturday. So a very, very interesting dynamic there. This is a game that, for me, I'd love to have it on Rivalry Saturday, but it also gets kind of lost in the shuffle when you're up against the Michigan-Ohio State game, and especially when Georgia Tech has kind of been tapering off a little bit, and that game has become a little bit more lopsided than it has been in the past. Obviously, last year was not that way, but definitely has been a little bit more lopsided in recent years. It's going to get a little bit overshadowed. Now, moving it back to a Friday night where a lot of people don't have a ton going on, maybe you have family in town, maybe you're just still working over that Thanksgiving hangover, whatever it looks like, you can definitely watch this game, and it's a fantastic game. It's one of my favorite games in college football, mostly because I grew up watching it very closely, but it's definitely one of those games that I think deserves a little bit more love, deserves a little bit more shine, and putting it on its own day will definitely do that. So very, very excited about that. I think that's one of the moves that I'm not too broken up about by any means. You have Penn State at West Virginia. That's the opening week. They're going to be at noon. Definitely getting my schedule ready for that opening week. Definitely getting the TVs. Got to figure out which is going where and when, and how I'm going to kind of channel surf on these days. So definitely going to be a huge game there. I think that's a very fascinating one between two teams that could make some noise in their conferences, but if they're going to do it, they likely have to win this game. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that. We had Arkansas and Oklahoma State. They're going to be at noon the following week. So definitely some great matchups these first couple of weeks. Definitely a lot to watch these first couple of weeks. I think this Arkansas-Oklahoma State game is going to be a great moniker for what Oklahoma State can be this year. Arkansas is a great team. I think they're going to be a team that in the next couple of years kind of starts to build up. But the reality is right now, Oklahoma State should win that game. And if they don't win that game, they might be in a little bit of trouble in their Big 12 and possibly playoff hunt this upcoming year. So that'll be a fascinating one to watch. We also got a doubleheader on CBS with Notre Dame at Purdue, then Colorado versus Colorado State. Now, if we get a repeat of what we got last year from Colorado State, I think we're going to have plenty of fun. There's no two ways about that. I think that's going to be an incredible matchup. If Notre Dame has lost by then, they play A&M to open the season. They are not a favorite right now. So say they lose that game, the Purdue game becomes that much more important. Not necessarily, the toughest opponent in the world, but going to their place, playing a team that I think is building up under Ryan Walters is not necessarily what you want to be in, especially with one loss already on the schedule. So definitely a game to watch there. Definitely a ton of things that went on yesterday with a ton of different game times and possible movements and everything in between that came out yesterday. And it'll be a fascinating thing to watch. I think when you look at a lot of these games and you look at kind of how important they are, you don't want them to move necessarily. You don't want Texas and OU to be moving a little bit later in the day, partly because of the tradition, partly because I worry for the health of some of the people that are around Dallas that day. But also, you don't want, Georgia Tech and Georgia moving off that Saturday. But all of this stuff feels relatively benign to me. And it feels like, especially for the Egg Bowl and for Georgia Tech and Georgia, it gives them even bigger of a shine. And they definitely should get that. I think the Egg Bowl is one of the most unique and fascinating matchups that we get every single year. I think Georgia Tech and Georgia is one of those where, honestly, in the past, you've been able to kind of throw out the record books. Obviously, Georgia has kind of dominated in some years, but there have been a couple of years where Tech plays them really close like they did a year ago, or they win the game like they did in 2016 and 2014, and do some things that people aren't expecting them to do. So I have no problem with those games getting a little bit more shine than they already do. I have no problem with them moving a little bit to get that shine. So definitely not necessarily the tradition aspect that we all love about this sport, but the reality is, as long as the football's on, as long as it, is standalone and I can watch it, I don't really have much of an issue. It's definitely not necessarily something I would love to happen, I suppose, but the reality is getting more shine on some of these games like the Egg Bowl, like clean old-fashioned hate, that's the good thing for college football, and definitely something that I am very excited about. So it'll be interesting to watch all of this stuff. It definitely didn't even scratch the surface of all of the stuff that came out yesterday, so definitely check in on all of the things, especially your team, where they're going to be playing. But we'll take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about college football 25. A ton of updates came out after all of the media guys went down to Orlando and finally were able to speak on it a little bit. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.